Okay, Dan, if you want to do your thing, get
Do
started.
my thing.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone. I am here to introduce Kristen Amman, who is a phenomenal doc student in our program, as are many of you. And she's going to talk today about some of the research she's been a part of on the Courage Project. This is a particular piece of that work that she's actually taken the lead on and working on a publication from that. But Kristen generally focuses on developmental math and specifically relearning. But this is actually going to be a piece of students and the types of events they experience in pre-calculus and calculus class that discourage them. So she's going to characterize that for us today. So thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Dan is actually not my advisor, for anyone who doesn't know. I typically work with Pablo, but my very first year here, I met with Dan and he told me of the Courage Project and asked if I was interested. Asked if I was interested in helping with data collection. And as a first year student, I was like, wow, I'd love to jump in on this right when it started. And now here we are 4 years later, and I'm super excited to be sharing the results of basically 3 years of data collection. So this, as Dan said, the title of this is all about discouraging events for historically marginalized students in pre-calc and calculus. And I'll get into detail a little bit later on about every single aspect of that. So why pre-calc and calc, who are historically marginalized students in these spaces, and why the distinction between discouraging events and these like critical features. Why can't I? Oh. Here we go. So as Dan said, this is just a small piece of data from a really large project called the Courage Project. You can see the logo there at the top. So Courage is an acronym that stands for Challenging, Operationalizing, and Understanding Racialized and Gendered Events in Undergrad Math. This work is supported by 2 grants and a huge team of people. So I am currently representing 2 PIs, 2 co-PIs, GSE faculty, tons of graduate students, and lots of Aresti students from Rutgers and Vanderbilt. So I just wanted to acknowledge everyone's contributions and just make it known that I am representing very, very, very much collaborative work. So the overall project has these sort of overarching research questions that ask, what specific aspects of undergrad math classrooms leave white women and students of color feeling marginalized? So white women and students of color being historically underrepresented, historically marginalized in mathematics due to these racialized and gendered stereotypes about ability in math. How do different students, including various subpopulations, both represented and not, perceive events that leave white women and students of color feeling marginalized, and to what extent are these marginalizing events prevalent in pre-calc and calc instruction? How often do they happen? So these are kind of like the overarching research questions, and today I'm really just taking a piece of our data that answers this first one. What specific aspects or events in undergrad math classrooms leave white women and students of color feeling marginalized? And so specifically for today, we're talking about discouraging events. So what are the features of pre-calc and calc instruction that leave historically marginalized students feeling discouraged? And how do those students distinguish between events that they find to be discouraging and events that they find to be discouraging as well as racialized? So you might be wondering why pre-calc and calc. For those of you who are not familiar with the math ed space, I'd like to make this hopefully a friendly talk for you. So in most universities in the United States, PreCalc and Calc are considered to be entry-level courses. That is, like, you're not required to take them or expected to take them necessarily to get into university. And these mark the very beginning of basically all STEM majors and certainly math majors. And these courses have historically served as gatekeepers to math and STEM majors, particularly for white women, Black men and women, and Latinx men and women. That gap between, like, who is getting, between white men and Asian men and women getting math and STEM degrees and historically marginalized students getting STEM degrees is starting to narrow slightly in the past 10 years, but overall that trend is basically continuing today. And another reason why we particularly care about PreCalc and Calc is because grades in those courses are typically highly influential of whether or not someone decides to continue on pursuing their STEM degree or if they switch to a non-STEM degree, particularly for women and students of color. So we are really, really concerned with what is going on inside of these courses to produce those sort of differential impacts by race and gender. And one of the things that we're going to be focusing on today is building on decades of research that has documented how students experience learning math differently based on their race or gender. So I've just sort of put a smattering of articles here that all talk about marginalizing aspects of early math and later math instruction for women and students of color as they're sort of pursuing math and STEM degrees. So when we say something like a racialized experience, this is basically what we're talking about, that people who are historically underrepresented in this field constantly are incurring events where their race is a very salient part of the meaning that they're making out of a particular event, an experience, a class, etc. And one of the reasons that the Courage Project is focused on college in particular is because there has started to be equity-oriented research specific to PreCalc and Calc instruction in the last few years, but very few of them actually take into consideration like the institutional and socio-historical context. So for example, there was this massive study that surveyed these like highly successful PreCalc and Calc programs in United States universities and neglected to take into consideration the fact that these were all PWIs. So that wasn't really a part of their analysis when they were talking about what makes these programs highly effective and for whom. So we thought that it was really important to conduct a study that was very much situated in the Rutgers institution and that focused on women and students of color's experience in that first year of math instruction. Another reason to sort of focus on math, I think sometimes when people hear us say a racialized experience in mathematics, they can kind of raise their eyebrows and think like, well, what is there really about math that could be racialized? And that's because there's this common view of mathematics as being culturally neutral, despite the fact that it is created by people. And the thing that we're talking about when we mean like a racialized experience are the interactions that you have that are necessary for the actual learning of mathematics and the valuing of ideas in a classroom, whose ideas are taken up, whose are considered mathematical or not. These are all interactions in which sort of that privileged status of whiteness can come out and leave women and students of color feeling marginalized, feeling a lack of belongingness, feeling like the expectation is that they won't do well. And so if anyone's curious, so today we're really going to be talking and grounding ourselves in these like specific events in these classes that leave PreCalc and Calc students feeling marginalized. But if you're curious, we do have some other publications, one of which is out right now and one of which is coming. And they sort of take one of them takes a broader look at all of this to talk about the features of undergrad math in particular as sort of like a whole space that allow these racialized and gendered interactions to occur. And the other one takes sort of an even narrower look at how students are experiencing these events. So I'm really just going to be showing you what the events are, why students found them to be discouraging and possibly racialized. But we do have another study that gets into more detail about like when a student is experiencing an event like this, how they're responding and reacting to it. So those are two other takes on this huge data set, if you're interested. But today, like I said, we're really going to be just sort of talking about what do discouraging and racialized events actually look like in day-to-day pre-calc and calc college classrooms. And how do students assign meaning to events as racialized? What are some of the things that they consider when deciding if an event is going to be perceived as racialized for them? And one of the reasons that we want to do this, that we want to focus on student perceptions in sort of their day-to-day lives, is because this helps us contribute to a better understanding of how discouraging experiences in pre-calc and calc on a day-to-day basis might contribute to these broader, more systemic influences of racism in mathematical spaces. So thinking about connecting that sort of disparity in STEM and math degrees with women and students of color to things that are happening in their early day-to-day lives of their college careers. So as I said, this study comes from a huge amount of data, and I just sort of want to give an overview of all of the data that we have so I can situate the data I'll be talking about today. So this study involved us collecting data from fall 2017 to spring 2019. And it started with student journaling, as I said in the little blurb about the talk. So we had 20 students. These were composed of white women, Black men and women, and Latinx men and women, who all would be enrolled in pre-calc and calc classes and would journal about discouraging or uncomfortable events that either they experienced or that they saw somebody else experiencing in their classroom. And in total, we got 85 events across 3 semesters of data collection. So that was fall, spring, and then another fall for that particular data collection. In the journal prompt that students were given, they were asked to describe the event that had occurred, including a description of how frequently similar events have occurred to this in the past, how they thought the event could be discouraging or uncomfortable for themselves or others, and the extent to which they saw race or gender playing a role. We're just going to be talking about the race piece in the data today. So they were explicitly asked about if they saw race as being a salient feature of the event. After we collected all of the events, we sort of looked across them and tried to think about a way that we could interview students about kind of the major themes that were coming out of the events without having to show each of them all 85. So we created these things called stimulus events. Sorry, I could hear an echo for some reason. In which we chose certain events that were kind of more or less representative of the whole corpus, removed them of identifiers so that other students could connect with them, and gave them to students in individual interviews. So these were the same 20 students that we had journaling the whole time. We interviewed them about how they would respond to these events if they happened to them, any kind of marginalizing features of the events, and how they would perceive them in general. We also brought these events to focus groups, and these were focus groups composed of everybody. So these had white men and women, Asian men and women, Latinx men and women, Black men and women, all viewing these same events and discussing the extent to which they would find them to be uncomfortable, discouraging or not, racialized or not, etc. So the data collection was quite extensive. And the thing that we're really just going to be talking about today is this very first part. So the sort of heart of the whole study is what I'll be presenting today. And that is this collection of 85 events across the 3 semesters. So after we got our corpus of events, we had 2 things to analyze. One of them was the student description of what had happened, and the other was their reflection on the event, how they felt about it, any sort of impacts of race, etc. So we started with some just general open coding with the descriptions, just to sort of make note of the actual action that had taken place. What is it that the instructor had done in the event? So this could be something like dismissing students, treating a student differently than other students, etc. And then we sort of narrowed in on and did a little bit more interpretive work concerning what I call the primary content of the event, which really just means what phenomena, what is it that the student was feeling discouraged about? Was it about their ability being questioned in the math classroom? Were they embarrassed because they were reprimanded for some kind of behavior? All of that good stuff. And then sort of what we did when trying to identify what distinguished discouraging events from those that were discouraging and racialized is we looked across our descriptors and tried to find those that best categorized the events that were seen as racialized and not those that were not seen as racialized. So if we were sort of reading a racialized event, how would it tend to be described similarly to the others in that group, and do those same characteristics also describe non-racialized events or not? So in total, from our 85 events, we had 34 where race was noted as a factor and 51 where it wasn't. And I put a little rundown of who these events were submitted by. So you can see, for example, for the 34 where race was noted as a factor, 28 of those were submitted by our 4 Latina women participants, 4 from Black women and 2 from white women. And you can see a similar breakdown for the race not noted categories. And I don't present these to make any kind of like statistical claims, more just like some descriptives of what the data set looked like. So in terms of, I'm going to sort of split up the findings into 2 parts. One of them is more just describing the discouraging events in terms of like the content. What is it that students were discouraged about? And then we'll move into the racialized talk. So this is sort of part 1. What is it that students were being discouraged by? And so here we actually had 7 codes, but I only have 5 up here because the remaining 2 played such a very small part of the data set that I didn't think it was really as worth discussing as these others. So you can see on our far left column, these are all of our content codes, and they are ordered in terms of frequency in the data set. So we have mathematical contribution, for example, being the most common type of discouraging event that, that came up in 34 out of the 85 discouraging events. Events could be double coded, so that column over there is not going to add to 85. But for example, with like a mathematical contribution, this would involve a student who perhaps asked a question about a specific piece of mathematical content or tried to offer some kind of suggestion maybe on a problem and was responded to in a way that they perceived to be negative. So for example, this is an example from our data set. A student asks a question involving like some simplification with square roots, and they get laughed at by their instructor, who then refuses to actually answer their question. The student ends up being embarrassed, apologizes for asking the question, and moves on. So in that case, the thing that the discouraging event was about is the reaction to the student's mathematical contribution, saying us discussing square roots is not something that is a worthy contribution to this class. And just one more thing to note about these is that we did sort of have 2 types of things that the discouragement should be about. So the ones that have the asterisks on the left, math contribution, recognition, and behavior, those tended to be things that, or those were events where the thing that was discouraging was the thing that was happening right in the moment. Whereas things like emotional tone and ability tended to be things that were actually sort of implications for the student's future or something that might happen in the future. So an event about ability, for example, is a judgment about your potential in the future to do well in the class rather than something that happened right now, today. just something to know. So let's go into an example of mathematical contribution. So this was, as I said, our most frequently occurring event. So this is from Beatrice, who was a Latina woman in our study. And she gives this description of her discouraging event that she observed. She said, I had just finished asking a question and my professor asked if anybody else had a question, and a student next to her raises her hand and asks if the professor could go over any question related to a domain of a function, just a particular type of problem. And the professor rejects the student and says they had just finished going over a domain question, so they're not going to do another one. The professor goes on to see if anyone else has any questions, and while that's happening, the girl who asked the original domain question turns to someone next to her and says, I want to do a different problem. I'm going to do a different problem. So this was coded as mathematical contribution because it was something that the student was discouraged by, sort of right in the moment. We're talking about your specific mathematical contribution to the class not being considered a worthy topic of discussion. And here's her reflection on this. So she says that she feels like this situation could have been handled differently if the professor had just spent a couple of minutes addressing the student's concern. She sort of says one of the reasons that she finds this to be so uncomfortable is because situations like this makes her feel like she can't rely on her professor. And she's sort of bothered by the fact that to her, the student isn't asking this question because she wasn't paying attention to the previous domain problems, but because she genuinely needs more help. So that rejection is something that she found to be discouraging. So that's sort of an overview of what an event tended to look like. And now I just want to, right before we jump into the description of what sort of distinguished between a discouraging event and one that was also racialized, I want to make a quick note on interpretation of this data set. So we only have 34 events that were considered to be racialized, and we're not particularly claiming that these are like representative of every type of thing that could be discouraging to a student, nor are we claiming that this is representative of everything that a student could consider when something's racialized or not. It's very important to keep in mind, these are things that the students had to be aware of. They had to remember to journal about them later in class. They had to be comfortable enough identifying them as being discouraging. There's lots of caveats to give. So I would just caution anyone who wants to interpret the findings of this. Our goal here isn't really to try to answer this question of like, what is it that makes a math contribution in general racialized? But what we can do with this data, and what I think is so valuable about this data is we're really getting a look into the day-to-day lives of things that are discouraging and or racialized to students. We're getting things that they are conscious of that are clearly making an impact. And what we can do with the features that are useful to us in distinguishing between discouraging events and those that are racialized in this data set is we can create hypotheses that can be followed up on in future research. So for example, some of the findings that I'm going to share with you today about what distinguished between discouraging and racialized events actually came up again when we were looking at group interviews in a way that none of us anticipated. Many of the people working on those interviews did not work on this event analysis. And I was like, wow, that is very similar to what we found here. And another thing that obviously we'd like to do with this is to put these pieces in conversation with existing literature. So just a note on that before we dive right in. So here we go. So this is sort of our breakdown of the events where race was noted as a factor and those where it was not by the type of event that it was. So a couple of things to point out here that I've sort of highlighted in purple. So one of them was if an event was considered racialized, it was most likely to be about a math contribution, ability, or recognition. All that means is that those are the highest numbers in our group of 34. And another thing to note is emotional tone. That second category there was very underrepresented in our race noted category, especially when compared to its relatively large representation in the overall data set. So those really almost never tended to be labeled as something involving race. And now let's get into the features. So if we have, just going back for a second, so for example, if we have 18 math contribution events in which race is noted as a factor and 16 where it wasn't noted as a factor, that's a relatively even split across those two groups. So what was it that made the difference between a math contribution event that was just discouraging and one that was discouraging as well as racialized? That's what I'm going to show you in this next table here. So there were two features of events that tended to be the most useful to us in distinguishing between these two categories. And that was a pattern of behavior and differential treatment. And I'll go into what I mean by both of those in 1 second, but just to point out here, same thing in those red categories, that these features, especially when combined, so when you're looking through the data set, if you require an event to have both a pattern of behavior and differential treatment, it almost never would show up in events where race was not noted as a factor. Same thing, but kind of opposite take. If you make it so that it's neither a pattern of behavior nor differential treatment, it was very unlikely that you were reading an event where race was noted as a factor. So those were features that were really useful to us in distinguishing between these two different categories of events. So you might be wondering how this actually plays out. So let me show you a comparison of two events that were the exact same type. So they were about the same thing in terms of content, one of which was seen as racialized and one that was not. So here we go. On the left, we have an event that was submitted by Regina, who is a Black woman in our study. And this is an event that is about recognition and involves differential treatment and was not seen as racialized. So Regina describes a scenario in which she came very early to recitation because she sort of wanted to show her professor that she was taking things more seriously since she had done kind of poorly on her last quiz. So she, along with some other students, came to class early and she's waiting for her professor to hand out quizzes and she doesn't get one yet. But she notices that as time is getting closer to the start of class, her professor is following the students that are entering the classroom around and really making sure that they get their quiz. And Regina still doesn't get one. And then her professor starts teaching and she still does not have this quiz. And she thinks to herself, well, maybe it's just because everybody who got here early didn't get their quiz, but no, it was in fact just her. So she has to sort of go up to the front of the room while the professor is teaching and ask for her quiz. She notes that this was especially something that she was surprised by since she was sitting right in the very front, right in front of her instructor, so should have been very visible to her instructor, but wasn't. And she says she felt overlooked. So this is a scenario obviously very uncomfortable and discouraging. She wanted to be recognized by this instructor in a lot of ways, maybe for trying harder on her quiz, for showing up early, and got ignored. So now let's compare that to this event from Jasmine, who wasn't a Black woman in our study. This is another event about recognition, just like Regina's was, that involved both differential treatment and a pattern of behavior and was seen as racialized. So here, Jasmine is describing that her professor overlooked her raised hand after asking for a solution to a question. Jasmine, just like Regina, was in the first row. So she's kind of surprised that her hand is overlooked, especially given that nobody else has their hand up and is offering an answer. And she notes that this particular professor has a slight tendency to look towards certain students for answers, indicating that she is not one of those people. And she says that this could make someone feel inadequate or not capable of answering the question. She then goes on to connect this scenario to other scenarios that she has seen in the past, where she's seen that it's common for teachers, perhaps unconsciously, to typically look towards white and or Asian male students for the correct answer to the question. So she sort of connects this experience of differential treatment to a whole pattern of events that she's experienced over her lifetime, in which she has been not recognized for the contribution that she wants to make to the class, perhaps because the people that tend to get recognized in class are white men and Asian men who are assumed to have the answer to this question. So this is kind of a typical example of what we would see in terms of events that were relatively similar in terms of content, in terms of what was discouraging about them, in which the difference for the racialized event was that we have this pattern over one class, over a lifetime of events of differential treatment. So let's wrap up with some conclusions and implications for future work. So a really big thing to note here is that when I say a pattern of behavior, I'm not just talking about one professor doing one thing over and over again. So it's not like Regina's instructor is very likely to forget to give her a quiz every single time. Typically what we would see when we're talking about patterns of behavior are those that go beyond the current semester. So students who are connecting events that they're seeing in class to past math classes that they've had before. And this connects to some of our other findings from the rest of our data and from not just us, from many other bodies of work, that historically marginalized students bring whole lives worth of experience navigating these racialized perceptions of their belongingness and ability. So it's advantageous for them to recognize patterns of racialized behavior so that they can avoid consequences in the form of emotional and cognitive labor. So you don't want to be dealing with someone who is going to have low expectations of you. You don't want to deal with the embarrassment of not being recognized, perhaps because you're a Black woman in this class. So these are things that you want to anticipate and connect to past experiences. And the second thing being that differential treatment is differential from the student's perspective. So it's very likely that many of these events are things that instructors don't notice or aren't maybe doing intentionally, like with malice, or, you know, overlooking Jasmine's hand because they don't like her, because they explicitly think that she is not going to have a correct answer. These are really things where we need to think beyond intentionally harmful acts motivated by prejudice. That's almost never what was in our data set. These are things that were more subtle. These are things, again, I linked to Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists there, because I think that kind of fits into talking about racialization in math, kind of fits into what can happen in our broader discourse about race, where the focus a lot is on the impact of the instructor. But when we're talking about a racialized experience, we're not talking about that at all. We are talking about the perception of the student and the impact on the student, regardless of the intent. And lastly here, one of the big takeaways of this is that learning how to best support historically marginalized students requires you to explicitly acknowledge inequitable systems and their influence on their lives. So it will be very hard for you to figure out how to disrupt a marginalizing pattern of behavior if you don't know what those patterns of behaviors are in the first place, if you don't get to know your students and learn about differential treatment that you may, however unintentionally, have caused. And for anyone here who is curious about connecting some of these practices to, for example, mathematical standards, Common Core standards, I have cited a piece there that explicitly connects state standards with these equitable practices for teaching with really concrete and good examples. And yeah, thank you so much. As I said, this is a hugely collaborative work led by Dan Beatty and Luis Lieva. So if you have any questions about the Courage Project in general, they are the two to contact. And of course, you can always contact me. And I put my email there as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. We'll open it up to questions now. If anyone, you can, let's see, use the Zoom raise hand. You can jump in, use the chat, any method you'd like.
I'm interested in the focus group composition and a little bit what came out of that. Were the focus groups heterogeneous with regard to the various dimensions that you mentioned, white males and Hispanics, blacks, and so on? And how did they perceive the events?
We had, oh, sorry, I think, oh, okay. We had always in the groups that there would be a match in either race or gender, and that we split students up so that people who were represented in undergrad math were in focus groups together, and people who were historically underrepresented were in focus groups together. So you would have like white men with Asian men, you could have Asian men and women together, Black men and Latinx men together, etc. And these are more preliminary findings than others, I guess. So Dan, stop me if I'm saying too much. Right now, the thing that we're sort of doing is looking at the frames that are available to people for interpreting these events. Obviously, we can't claim that some frames aren't available, but like, for example, the frame of like color blindness, or of thinking that an event can only be racialized if race is explicitly mentioned, was something that we saw way more often in the groups with white men, and Asian women than in any of the others. Not to say that it didn't happen in the others, because it did, but it was much more often used and fallen back on as a tool, even when other frames were introduced as a possibility. So one of the common types of frames from groups with women and students of color, for example, was this idea of personal experience and of connecting the event I'm seeing now to one that I consider to be similar from my whole past history of dealing with racialized events. That was a frame that was available to all of the groups, but consistently much more taken up by the groups of women and students of color. Oh, and yes, sorry, tell me if I answered your question.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And by the way, it was a great talk. I really think this work is extremely important. And I'm so glad you're doing it. I know some years ago we talked about your development of these ideas. So it's terrific to see it coming out this way.
Yeah, this one was like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And Ravi made a comment.
You see that?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Hey, Kristen, this is awesome talk.
Hi.
I love it. It's terrific. So I'm just wondering if you also, two questions, or one is in intersectionality and whether or not you noticed that played out in the data. Did you capture it? And also, you talk about racialized, but I'm assuming that some of these were gendered, and I don't know if you're lumping that together or not. I'm just curious about that.
There were separate findings by gender. I decided not to share them for this particular presentation because in terms of analyzing the journals and whether or not people found them to be gendered, A, we didn't get that many gendered events, so it was kind of hard, but B, they had relatively the exact same pattern of if it was a pattern of behavior and differential treatment found to be gendered. But in like the rest of the data set, in terms of the individual interviews and the group interviews, that is something that we actually take much more seriously than I've sort of washed over here. Particularly in the group interviews, that was something that like we had gotten comments on in terms of like in a group with like Latinx men and women, even then we would find some interesting like conversational turns that seem to be reflecting these kind of like more subtle power imbalances between the men and the women in the group. That was actually, we have something that a paper that we're working on right now, and that was one of the big comments that we got in terms of even just the small amount of data that we shared. So we're definitely still looking into that. Dan, I hope that wasn't glossing too much over that.
I think that's right, but I don't think we found much intersectional in terms of the journaled events.
Yeah.
I think we we can see some of that play out more qualitatively. I think the other interesting thing is like even when we interviewed them or put them in, did group interviews with them, some of them didn't necessarily have the language of intersectionality. So we really had to look at patterns and what they were saying. And so that comes out a little more there, but not necessarily from some of their words, but the ways in which they feel something is marginalizing and looking at patterns that way.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, we definitely, like, especially I remember in some of the group interviews, especially with like gendered experiences, I distinctly remember some quotes that we have about people saying that we're done with that now in math, and there are no more gendered disparities in mathematics, or people who would sort of say, I think maybe I've heard that women can have a harder time in mathematics, or I think there was a study that maybe has shown this, but I'm not sure. So there was much more of like a hesitancy. I think that was actually in the group with white men and white women where that occurred. Much more hesitancy than with race.
Any other questions?
So I don't have a question, but I have a comment. So Kristen, your presentation was amazing.
Thanks, Daniel.
It was insightful and really well explained. The part that really stuck out to me was on slide 19. I think it was 19, where you shared about what types of interactions were racialized. And yeah, what really struck me was we might expect that racialized interactions came from something like character or behavior, but the fact that it's connected to mathematical contribution, ability, and recognition, and how I think what your data really shows is how racialized math is, which really dings this concept of math as objective. And I don't have a question about it. I just think that that's really important to understand exactly what students of color are going through in math, and kind of helps to just ding that math as objective, because it clearly isn't. So I thought that was really powerful.
Thank you. And this is one of the weird things too, where like, that's why I put the big caveat in there, because I don't want to give the impression that racialized events are not about behavior or character integrity. We just didn't get a lot of them. But like, I actually think one of Dan's pieces talks about how like Black boys, for example, are disciplined far more often in the classroom than white boys who do the exact same behaviors. And like in general, the whole trend of Black students being expelled much more often for the same type of behavior, like taken out of the classroom, than white students, like those definitely exist.
Yeah.
They just happen to not show up in our data set.
Right.
And I think it plays out a little different in a college classroom or in behavior than it does K-12.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising to read some of the behavior ones, because you don't really think of someone being reprimanded too often in college.
Yeah.
Clark just put something in the chat. He's wondering if you've presented your findings to mathematics faculty and instructors, or have had informal discussions with mathematics faculty instructors, and what their reaction has been.
We have tried to. They're actually two of the focus groups were supposed to be math instructors, and we had a hard time with recruitment and scheduling to get them all in the same room at the same time. But in general, well, I don't know, because we only really had 3, right?
We did professional development with math instructors too.
Oh yeah. Do you want, I don't know, you can talk about that if you'd like to.
Well, you were the one there.
Oh, I did. Oh yeah, actually, if Edna is here still, she was there. Yes, she is. We got to talk to the math teaching group, Emily and I, Emily Wolf McMichael, who is also part of the Courage team. I don't know if she's on this call. But yeah, they were really fascinated by the events themselves. I think one of the things, like I said in the beginning, that's the hardest to think about. And actually that Danielle kind of touched on is just like, what could I possibly be doing in a math classroom that could be even cultural or even like relational in some way. So I think showing these concrete examples are really helpful. And obviously they've been curious about what am I supposed to do about this, which is a whole other part of the data that we also collected where we asked students what they would prefer instructors to do instead, or how they could actually be supported or affirmed in situations like this. And that's a whole other category of data that we were writing up.
Yeah, well, we've also had two presentations at the joint mathematical meetings. I think generally, except for the instructor interviews, we presented to, I think, instructors who've been like somewhat open to thinking about this, or very open to thinking about this. And I think they found it really interesting and reflective on it. But I think in some ways, those are people who are going to presentations,
Yeah,
and opting into like finding out more about how instruction is more racialized and gendered. And so they've been quite open to it. We haven't necessarily, except in some of the instructor interviews where I don't think the instructors were necessarily as open to it, and maybe they represent a little bit broader population. And there's some ongoing work by Brittany Marshall, who's on here, and Taylor McNeil, who's a doc student at Vanderbilt. Yeah, and the people who are open to it, I think, have been eating up. And so I think there's one idea to turn some of this data, both in terms of the events and some of the interviews, into materials for professional development for instructors more broadly, and to embed those in some different organizations. But yeah, I don't think we have a ton of insight on that yet, but
Anyone else? Oh, Christian, do you have something?
Yeah, I have a question. So maybe I should know this. I know you present on this a lot, but I can't remember the answer. So some of your journal events that you described today, some were like a student had a particular experience, so there was an interaction and they were involved. And at least one, maybe exactly one, was a student kind of observed an interaction between another student and the instructor.
yeah.
I was wondering if you looked at those separately, maybe if not officially, then if you noticed any interesting patterns unofficially. And I'm also interested because it seems a lot like what you did later in the project when you presented these events to a third party, whether it was the individual students who were journaling or the focus groups, but because it's like once removed. Although when it happened in the journals, it kind of came to you once removed. So I'm wondering if there was anything interesting there.
In terms of ones that are sort of more indirect, we didn't look at those necessarily like separately in terms of analysis. They were kind of seen as like just not as strong evidence, though, if we were trying to make any particular claims about how somebody would feel about an event. So if they would say like, I think that someone like this might feel like this, then that's a much less strong claim about what they find to be discouraging about it than if they would say, I would feel like this. So I think that was Beatrice's event, yeah, where she's like watching somebody else go through this scenario. And one of the reasons that I shared it is because in her reflection, she talks about how she would feel if a similar thing happened to her. And we did have, I don't know how satisfying of an answer this will be, but in terms of what I talked about a little bit before with like the group interviews and sort of the frames that people would bring to be able to think through events, that ability to say, if I were the person in this event experiencing it, how would I feel, was not a frame that was always used by all of the different groups, especially when thinking of an event as being racialized. So for example, we had an event where an instructor was talking to a whole class, and we had many students in the groups with Black and Latinx students who would say, I would hear that and I might be discouraged because I would think that that person was talking to me. And sort of imagining what it would be like if they had heard it, whereas we slightly more often had in the white and Asian groups, people saying, I'm not even going to consider what it would be like to experience that. I will not play game with that because there's no way that I could take that to mean anything other than a statement to the entire class. So I do think like with certain types of events that was more likely to happen, like where someone was describing what happened to somebody else, or if it was sort of more indirect and said to a whole group, I think it's much more likely that that indirectness would occur.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Anybody else? We still have some time.
I have one more comment. I don't want to take up time of other people, but my comment is that it really goes beyond your research. That there are also very important structural and policy situations in mathematics that have racialized effects. For example, it was noted that 40% of the students in these entry-level courses typically get D's and F's. There's a role that's played by placement tests in putting people into the courses. There's a role that's played by the substantial decrease in the availability of small professor-taught sections, so that what were formerly taught in sections of maximum 30 students now is taught in big lectures with recitations, which is not the same thing. There's very little opportunity or incentive for faculty to develop knowledge of their students individually, especially in big lecture courses. So I haven't taught in math at Rutgers in any of these entry-level courses, but when I was in Illinois, I coordinated such entry-level courses for the department. And so I encountered some of these structural issues very vividly, including a situation in which a number of Black students were accused of cheating and incurred various penalties because an exam had been leaked to a predominantly Black fraternity. While you could say students were individually responsible, there's a structural issue underlying that too. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on the policy side of this as well. And I hope that your research helps stimulate that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of these Brissot pieces that I cite here, he has a whole piece about, it's called, I think, like the strange role of calculus in United States education, and gets into detail about like a lot of the students that take these courses that take calculus or pre-calculus already took it in high school. And if you are a Black or Latinx student, you are much more likely to not have gone to a high school that even offered those courses in the first place, or like because you didn't take algebra in 8th grade, you didn't even have the opportunity to take pre-calc or calc in high school. So you have those students taking the placement test and taking pre-calc and calc with students who sometimes got like 5s on the AP exam. And then obviously graded on a curve, no incentive to get to know students. Brittany said her pre-calc class had over 200 students. I'm like very fortunate in that I'm teaching a pre-calc class right now that only has 40, but that's only because it's split up into 2 semesters rather than 1. I'm old though. Brittany, you're not that old. But yeah, absolutely. The structural issues have very much make it so that you're encouraged to like not question any of these things because you like simply don't have time, or you will get punished if you don't spend most of your time covering content and then inadvertently might do some of these things, and very much make it so that the whiteness of it all is always underlying and seen as normal and not questionable because it's inherent in the culture.
I'm also thinking too about the other paper that just came out from this work that Luis really led, that actually named some of the structures and the logics that actually, do you want to talk about that, Kristen?
Are you talking about, hang on.
You cited it earlier.
This one?
Yeah.
of sort of the, ugh, I don't even know if I remember everything from the paper. I should, it was the optional reading for today. But yeah, it sort of goes into detail about like specific features of undergrad math, like the, I hope I get these right, but like the pacing, for example, and like the pressure to cover content as being things that like allow these gendered and racialized, potentially marginalizing interactions to actually take place, more so than like other STEM classes in general, because math is more hierarchical. So there's more of like an intense pressure for the instructor to quickly move through these things and be mostly accepting of mathematical knowledge as like stuff that you immediately recognize. But yeah, that whole paper is like linked in the description here, so it's super good.
Yeah, so it doesn't quite get to the level that I think Jerry's talking about, but it
Yeah.
gets to mechanisms of competition, and
Yeah.
when that's a sort of cultural underpinning, like how does it position students, it gets to underrepresentation and stereotypes as broad ways in which students are positioned in racialized and gendered ways.
And I want to say, Brittany just reminded me, and Brittany's comment was, these were the biggest complaints or excuses instructors used in their interviews. I do want to note that like students also noted these things constantly. So it wasn't like we had like in the individual and group interviews, students not considering, kind of thinking of the impact over intent thing. Students routinely considered the intent of the professor, and considered the fact that the professor only has so much time to cover content, considered the fact that like this is a competitive field, so maybe I do need to hear this, and at the same time, this is how that made me feel. I think that's some of the best portions of the data are when we have students saying, yes, I understand why you may have said, if you can't do this problem quickly, you need to drop down to a lower class, and this is how that differentially impacts me. Hi, Matt. Matt Charnley, wonderful instructor, is also with us right now from the Rutgers Math Department. Yeah, but absolutely. These are things that like students are acutely aware of the culture as well. And I think that that's important to notice.
I think we have time for one more. If anyone wants to take the chance. I'm scrolling. Okay. I think that's it. Not seeing any other hands, so thanks. Thank you so much, Kristen. You're getting rave reviews in the chat. And
thanks for coming, everyone. And I really do, if you're curious about any of the papers that I've cited here, or want access to anything else, please contact me and let me know. I'm very happy to share them. Oh, thanks, everybody.
Okay. Hopefully we'll see you all next week. Take care.